You know, the most curious thing happened throughout my career. Brilliant minds kept wandering into Christianity, and people insisted I had something to do with it. Now, I never set out to convert anyone. Heaven knows, I was too busy trying to figure out my own faith. But here's the delicious paradox: the moment you stop trying to win arguments and start simply telling the truth with joy, people begin listening with their hearts as well as their heads. The intellectual giants of my time, Shaw, Wells, even some who remain my dearest opponents, found themselves wrestling not with my cleverness, but with something far more dangerous: common sense wrapped in wonder. Today, let's explore why the gentlest apologetic often proves the most irresistible, and how treating ideas as adventures rather than battles opens minds that arguments alone could never touch. Chapter 1: The Art of Making Truth Irresistible. The secret, if there is one, lies in a principle most apologists miss entirely: never make Christianity appear smaller than it actually is. You see, when I debated Shaw or Wells, I never tried to diminish the magnitude of what I was proposing. I wasn't asking them to believe in a comfortable little religion for comfortable little people. I was inviting them to embrace the most audacious claim in human history, that the creator of the universe became a carpenter in Palestine. Most apologetic fails because it tries to make Christianity reasonable in the sense of making it ordinary. But Christianity isn't ordinary, it's the most extraordinary thing that ever happened, which is precisely why it's true. When I told Wells that believing in Christ was like believing the sun could dance, I wasn't retreating from the absurdity, I was celebrating it. Because sometimes, on perfect mornings, if you're paying attention, the sun does seem to dance. The intellectual giants I knew weren't impressed by a Christianity that apologized for its own mysteries. They were intrigued by a Christianity that reveled in them. When you present the Incarnation not as an embarrassing puzzle to be explained away, but as the key that unlocks all other puzzles, suddenly brilliant minds lean forward rather than back away. I discovered that treating the great doctrines as magnificent paradoxes rather than logical problems changed everything. The Trinity isn't a mathematical impossibility, it's a window into the nature of love itself. Original sin isn't pessimistic theology, it's the only doctrine that can be verified by reading any morning newspaper. The resurrection isn't a violation of natural law, it's the promise that natural law serves a higher purpose. When Shaw accused me of believing impossible things, I agreed enthusiastically and pointed out that he believed them too, he just called them by different names. We both believed in invisible forces that govern the visible world. We both believed in moral obligations that transcended material necessity. The only difference was that he thought these beliefs made him progressive, while I thought they made me Christian. The moment you stop defending Christianity and start celebrating it, something magical happens. Opposition transforms into curiosity. Arguments become conversations. And conversations, handled with sufficient joy and wonder, sometimes become conversions, not because you've conquered anyone, but because you've invited them to join the greatest adventure ever offered to the human spirit. Chapter 2: Paradox as the Gateway to Truth. Here's what I learned from years of friendly combat with brilliant skeptics: the human mind is naturally drawn to paradox because paradox is where truth lives. The greatest thinkers I knew weren't satisfied with simple answers, they were hungry for answers complex enough to match the complexity of existence itself. And Christianity, properly understood, offers the most gloriously complex simplicity ever conceived. When I told my agnostic friends that Christianity was simultaneously the most hopeful and most realistic worldview, they couldn't dismiss it easily. How can you argue against hope? How can you argue against realism? The tension between these truths forced them to think more deeply than they'd planned. That's the beauty of paradox, it engages the whole person, not just the logical faculties. Take the central Christian paradox, that we must lose our lives to find them. Every great mind I encountered had experienced this truth in smaller ways. Shaw knew that his best plays emerged when he forgot about impressing audiences. Wells understood that his most powerful stories came when he lost himself in his characters' struggles. They lived the paradox professionally. I simply pointed out that Christ had articulated the principle they were already following. Or consider the paradox of Christian humility and Christian confidence. I never approached these giants as their intellectual inferior, cowering behind faith because reason had failed me. I approached them as someone who had found reason's ultimate fulfillment. True humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And ironically, this kind of humility produces a confidence that pure rationalism can never achieve. The most effective moment in any discussion came when I could show how Christian paradoxes resolved contradictions that secular thinking couldn't handle. How do you maintain both human dignity and human equality without some transcendent ground? How do you rebel against injustice without believing in objective justice? How do you love someone enough to tell them hard truths without believing in truth itself? I discovered that brilliant people aren't threatened by mystery, they're energized by it. What threatens them is shallow clarity that insults their intelligence. When you present Christianity as the deepest mystery that explains all other mysteries, when you offer it as the question that contains all answers, minds that have outgrown simple solutions suddenly find themselves intrigued. The great paradox of Christian evangelism is that the more impossible you admit it sounds, the more possible it becomes. When I told my skeptical friends that believing in Christ was like believing that winter could become spring, death could become life, and despair could become joy, they couldn't quite dismiss it, because they'd seen winter become spring every year of their lives. Paradox works because reality itself is paradoxical. Light behaves like both wave and particle. Life emerges from non-life. Consciousness arises from unconscious matter. The universe expands into nothingness. In a world already full of impossible truths, the resurrection begins to sound less like fantasy and more like the pattern behind everything else. Chapter 3: The Democracy of Common Sense. The most powerful weapon in my apologetic arsenal was something my intellectual friends had forgotten how to use: common sense. Now, by common sense, I don't mean common ignorance or common prejudice. I mean the common wisdom that emerges when ordinary people pay honest attention to ordinary life. And here's the wonderful irony: the greatest minds often rediscover profound truths by returning to this supposedly simple wisdom. Shaw, for all his brilliance, had talked himself out of believing in love, beauty, and moral obligation. Wells had convinced himself that human beings were merely clever animals with no special destiny. But watch them live for an hour, and you'd see them acting as if love were real, beauty mattered, and moral choices had eternal significance. They lived like Christians while thinking like materialists. I made it my business to point out these delightful contradictions with affection rather than mockery. When Shaw wrote passionately about social justice, I'd applaud his passion and gently ask where justice came from in a purely material universe. When Wells mourned the waste of human potential, I'd celebrate his mourning and wonder aloud why potential should matter if humans were merely accidental arrangements of atoms. The beauty of this approach is that it honors the person while challenging the philosophy. You're not attacking their humanity, you're defending it against their theories. You're saying, in effect, you're too good for your own worldview. Your heart knows truths your head has temporarily forgotten. Common sense tells us that children aren't just small adults, that love isn't just evolutionary programming, that beauty isn't just subjective preference, and that moral obligations aren't just social conventions. Every parent knows these truths. Every artist lives by them. Every reformer assumes them. The question is whether our philosophical systems are large enough to contain the wisdom we already possess. I found that the quickest way to make Christianity credible to brilliant skeptics was to show how it explained their own deepest experiences better than their conscious philosophies did. Why do you feel guilty about breaking promises if promises are just sounds? Why do you feel outraged by injustice if justice is just opinion? Why do you feel awed by beauty if beauty is just brain chemistry? Christianity doesn't ask us to believe impossible things, it asks us to believe the most natural things in the most natural way. It's naturalism that requires impossible faith. Try believing that your love for your children is really just genetic programming, or that your sense of right and wrong is really just cultural conditioning, or that your longing for meaning is really just misfiring neurons. That takes more blind faith than believing in angels. The great intellectual giants I knew weren't converted by complex arguments, they were converted by the recognition that Christianity made sense of things they'd never been able to explain otherwise. It gave them permission to trust their deepest intuitions while still using their finest minds. It offered them a worldview as large as their hearts and as rigorous as their thoughts. Common sense, properly understood, isn't the enemy of sophisticated thinking, it's the foundation that makes sophisticated thinking possible. Chapter 4: Joy as Irrefutable Evidence. Perhaps the most surprising discovery of my apologetic career was this: joy converts more minds than arguments ever could. Not shallow happiness or forced optimism, but that deep, inexplicable joy that springs from contact with ultimate reality. The intellectual giants I knew were brilliant enough to recognize authentic joy when they encountered it, and honest enough to admit they wanted it for themselves. You see, most of my skeptical friends weren't really arguing against Christianity, they were arguing against their image of Christianity as gloomy, restrictive, and life-denying. Shaw had convinced himself that religion was the enemy of vitality. Wells saw faith as the refuge of the defeated. But when they encountered a Christianity that was more alive, more adventurous, and more joyful than their secular alternatives, their objections began to sound hollow even to themselves. I never tried to argue people into joy, I simply let my own joy argue for itself. When someone is genuinely delighted with existence, genuinely grateful for consciousness, genuinely enchanted with the ordinary miracle of being alive, that delight becomes contagious. People want to know the source of such unreasonable happiness in what they perceive as an unreasonable world. The secret is that Christian joy isn't based on circumstances, it's based on the nature of reality itself. I wasn't happy because my life was perfect, but because life itself was perfect even when it was terrible. I wasn't optimistic because everything was going well, but because I knew that everything was going somewhere. This kind of joy doesn't depend on getting what you want, it depends on wanting what you get in the context of a grand adventure with a guaranteed happy ending. My intellectual friends were particularly struck by joy that could coexist with sorrow, hope that could acknowledge tragedy, and faith that could embrace doubt. They'd been taught that these were contradictions, but Christianity showed them that these were harmonies. You can weep over suffering while rejoicing in redemption. You can despair over sin while celebrating grace. You can doubt your understanding while trusting the one you're trying to understand. I discovered that the most convincing argument for Christianity is a Christian who is obviously having more fun than anyone else in the room. Not because their circumstances are better, but because their perspective is larger. They're not just living their own small story, they're participating in the greatest story ever told, playing a part in the cosmic romance between creator and creation. Wells once accused me of believing in fairy tales, and I heartily agreed. I pointed out that he believed in them too, he just called them tragedies instead of comedies. We both believed that individual choices mattered enormously, that love could conquer death, and that the future held possibilities beyond current imagination. The difference was that he found these beliefs depressing while I found them exhilarating. The joy of Christianity isn't the absence of sorrow, it's the presence of hope that gives sorrow meaning. It's not the denial of darkness, it's the confidence that light is stronger than darkness. It's not the pretense that everything is fine, it's the knowledge that everything will be fine, And that knowledge changes everything about how you experience the journey. Chapter 5: Exposing Modern Mythology with Gentle Laughter. The most effective way I found to challenge the prejudices of brilliant skeptics was through what I called the weapon of laughter. Not cruel mockery that wounds, but gentle humor that illuminates absurdities they'd never noticed. You see, every age has its unquestioned assumptions, and our modern age is no exception. The difference is that we call our assumptions science or progress, while calling everyone else's assumptions superstition. Shaw and Wells prided themselves on their rationalism, but they held to myths far more fantastic than anything in Christian theology. Shaw believed in a life force that somehow guided evolution toward higher consciousness, but when I pointed out that this sounded remarkably like the Holy Spirit, he became quite indignant. Wells believed that humanity was destined to transcend its current limitations and achieve godlike powers, but he insisted this was scientific rather than religious thinking. I made it my pleasant duty to point out these delightful inconsistencies. The materialists I knew believed in invisible forces, natural selection, miraculous transformations, evolution, and ultimate purposes, progress. They just used different vocabulary than Christians. They had faith in unseen realities, hope for future redemption, and moral obligations that transcended immediate self-interest. The only difference was that they thought their faith was more reasonable than mine. Consider the modern mythology of inevitable progress. My brilliant friends believed that history was automatically moving toward greater enlightenment, justice, and happiness, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. When I suggested that this required more blind faith than believing in providence, they accused me of pessimism. But which is more optimistic, believing that progress happens automatically, or believing that progress happens because someone cares enough to ensure it? Or take the modern superstition about human nature. The same people who insisted that humans were merely sophisticated animals also insisted that humans were morally obligated to transcend their animal instincts. They wanted to have it both ways, to explain away human dignity while simultaneously appealing to it. When I pointed out this contradiction with sufficient humor, they couldn't dismiss it as easily as they might have dismissed a serious argument. I discovered that laughter could penetrate intellectual defenses that logic alone could never breach. When you can show someone that their supposedly rational worldview leads to absurd conclusions, they begin to question assumptions they'd never examined. And once those assumptions start wobbling, the whole structure of materialistic thinking begins to look less solid. The key was always to laugh with people, not at them. I wasn't trying to humiliate brilliant minds, I was trying to free them from philosophies that were too small for their own grandeur. I wanted them to see that they were living like Christians while thinking like materialists, and that this inconsistency was making them unnecessarily miserable. Modern people have convinced themselves that religious faith is credulity while secular faith is sophistication. But it takes enormous faith to believe that consciousness emerged from unconsciousness, that moral obligations arose from immoral processes, and that meaning developed from meaninglessness. The only difference is that secular faith calls itself science while religious faith admits it's faith. When you can help brilliant people see that their supposedly rational worldview is actually a collection of unprovable assumptions held together by cultural prejudice, they begin to wonder whether other worldviews might be worth examining. And Christianity, properly presented, turns out to be far more intellectually satisfying than the alternatives. Chapter 6: The Wisdom of Ages Against the Arrogance of Progress. One of the most effective arguments I deployed against my brilliant contemporaries was what I called the democracy of the dead. This wasn't ancestor worship or mindless traditionalism. It was the simple recognition that the vast majority of human beings who have ever lived believed in realities beyond the material world, and that perhaps this consensus deserved more respect than our modern prejudices typically granted it. Shaw and Wells had convinced themselves that they were part of humanity's intellectual vanguard, bravely advancing beyond the superstitions of previous generations. But when I examined their supposedly progressive ideas more carefully, they turned out to be remarkably provincial. They were enslaved to the fashions of their particular time and place while imagining themselves free from all tradition. I delighted in pointing out that what they called modern enlightenment would have seemed barbarously narrow to ancient Greeks, medieval scholars, or Renaissance thinkers. The materialistic worldview that dominated our universities was actually a historical anomaly, a brief experiment that most of human civilization would have recognized as obviously inadequate to explain the full range of human experience. Consider the question of human dignity. Every civilization before ours had recognized that human beings possessed something that set them apart from other animals, call it soul, spirit, or divine spark. This wasn't primitive ignorance but sophisticated recognition of obvious facts. Humans create art, pursue truth, make moral choices, and long for transcendence in ways that purely material explanations cannot account for. But my materialist friends insisted that this universal human wisdom was simply error, and that only they and a few hundred other modern intellectuals had finally discovered the truth about human nature. This struck me as remarkably arrogant, like claiming that everyone who had ever lived was colorblind except for a small group of contemporary academics. The wisdom of ages isn't infallible, but it deserves a respectful hearing. When virtually every human culture has testified to experiences of the sacred, encounters with moral obligation, and intimations of transcendence, perhaps we should hesitate before dismissing these testimonies as mere superstition. The burden of proof should be on those who claim that billions of human beings throughout history were fundamentally mistaken about the nature of reality. I found that challenging the chronological snobbery of my era opened minds in unexpected ways. Wells, who prided himself on his historical imagination, began to wonder whether his progressivism might itself be a kind of temporal prejudice. Shaw, who had rebelled against Victorian conventional wisdom, started questioning whether his rebellion against tradition might be just another kind of conventionality. Christianity has the advantage of being both ancient and eternal, rooted in history but not limited by any particular historical moment. It can dialogue with Plato and Augustine, Aquinas and Pascal, but it can also speak to contemporary concerns because it addresses permanent features of human nature rather than temporary cultural fashions. When you can show brilliant people that their supposedly advanced thinking is actually quite provincial, and that Christianity offers access to a conversation that spans centuries and cultures, intellectual humility begins to replace intellectual pride. And once that happens, the heart becomes more receptive to truths that pure reason might resist. The greatest minds I knew were eventually won not by arguments but by the recognition that Christianity connected them to a tradition of thought and experience far richer than anything modernity alone could offer. Chapter 7: The Adventure of Surrendering to Something Greater. The final and perhaps most crucial element in the gentle conversion of intellectual giants was presenting Christianity not as a limitation of human potential, but as its ultimate fulfillment. The brilliant minds I knew weren't looking for smaller lives, they were hungry for larger ones. They wanted adventure, purpose, and significance worthy of their gifts. Christianity, properly understood, offered all of these in superabundant measure. Most modern apologetic makes the mistake of presenting conversion as a kind of intellectual capitulation, as if brilliant people must somehow shrink their minds to fit into faith. But the opposite is true. Christianity asks you to expand your mind until it's large enough to contain paradox, mystery, and infinite possibility. It invites you to use all your intelligence in service of truths too great for intelligence alone to grasp. When I spoke with Wells about his science fiction, I pointed out that his most imaginative stories were less fantastic than the central claims of Christianity. He wrote about time travel, but Christianity claims that eternity intersects with time. He imagined invisible men, but Christianity insists that the invisible world is more real than the visible one. He dreamed of human transformation, But Christianity promises it as guaranteed destiny. The great secret I learned was that intellectual giants aren't afraid of being asked to believe impossible things, they're afraid of being asked to believe boring things. Present Christianity as a comfortable refuge for people who can't handle reality, and brilliant minds will rightfully reject it. Present Christianity as the greatest adventure available to human consciousness, and those same minds lean forward with interest. Shaw understood this intuitively, even when he was fighting against it. His plays were always about transformation, redemption, and the possibility of becoming more than you were. When I suggested that his dramatic instincts were pointing him toward Christian truths, he couldn't dismiss the observation as easily as he might have dismissed a theological argument. His own artistic vision was already half Christian, he just hadn't recognized it yet. The conversion of an intellectual giant isn't a matter of winning debates, it's a matter of helping them recognize that their deepest aspirations can only be fulfilled in relationship with their Creator. Their hunger for truth points beyond finite truths to truth itself. Their love of beauty yearns for beauty itself. Their pursuit of goodness reaches toward goodness itself. I discovered that the most effective evangelistic question wasn't, "Do you believe in God?" but rather, "What do you live for that's worth dying for?" Because every great mind lives for something that transcends immediate self-interest. They believe in truth enough to sacrifice comfort for it. They believe in beauty enough to create art rather than merely consume entertainment. They believe in goodness enough to fight injustice even when it's costly. Christianity doesn't ask you to abandon these devotions, it asks you to recognize their source and destination. It doesn't diminish your commitment to truth, beauty, and goodness, it reveals why these commitments make sense and where they ultimately lead. It doesn't limit your intellectual curiosity, it provides the only framework large enough to contain everything you might discover. The moment when conversion becomes inevitable is the moment when a brilliant person realizes that Christianity doesn't compete with their highest aspirations, it fulfills them. It doesn't ask them to become less than they are, it reveals what they were always meant to become. It doesn't end their adventure, it shows them that their adventure has just begun. Conclusion. And so we return to where we began, the delicious paradox that the gentlest apologetic often proves the most irresistible. Not because it overwhelms opposition with superior argument, but because it reveals that opposition was never necessary in the first place. The greatest minds aren't enemies of Christianity, they're unconscious allies waiting to recognize themselves in the mirror of orthodox truth. The secret, if there is one, lies in treating every brilliant skeptic as a Christian who hasn't yet admitted it. Because if they love truth, beauty, and goodness, if they long for justice, meaning, and transcendence, if they believe that their choices matter and their lives have purpose, then they already live like Christians while thinking like something else. My joy has always been to help such magnificent minds discover the intellectual adventure that awaits them in Orthodox faith. Not the adventure of abandoning reason, but the adventure of following reason all the way home to its source. The most rebellious thing in our age isn't rejecting Christianity, it's embracing it as the most reasonable response to an unreasonably wonderful universe.